Welcome back to Prison Professors. This is episode number 2 with our guest, James Patterson, who's come down. God, it's about an hour drive from northern Los Angeles, right? All the way down to Orange County. But I asked him to come down here because I wanted to create a course that would help more people in jail and prison understand how the decisions you're making today influence what you can become. And in the previous episode, which you can probably identify on your iPad-like device or in however you're getting your courses. I recommend you watch the first episode so you can learn about his career of preparing through school, going into the military, taking jobs, and always thinking about what he wants to become. And he's a man who knew he wanted to build a career in computers. And what I'd love to hear about today, James, in this episode, is how you identified your transition or how you made the transition from the military into starting your career in, I guess we call it civilian life.
So, while I was in the military, so that was around 2001 to 2005, that's really when the internet really started taking off. So, I had a background in programming computers, but the thing about programming computers is, you're telling your own computer what to do. What was really cool about the internet was it was connecting all of these computers together, but ultimately it's connecting people together. And that just always really fascinated me the first time I ever, got into a chat room. And it's just like, oh my God, you can talk to all these other people on this thing called the internet. So I knew I really wanted to work in that field and, ultimately build things to be able to connect people. So the first job I took, when you leave the military, it's really interesting. So, when you leave the military, you're very prepared in some ways and very ill-prepared in other ways. So I think the ways I was prepared was, I had a lot of training in leadership, some technical aspects, how to lead people, but military life is just very different than civilian life. And you leave the military, you don't really have a network. So,
and you were only 24 or so when you left?
Yeah, 23, 24,
okay.
Coming out of the military. So, what I did is I went on at the time it was a website called Craigslist. It does still exist. But back then that was, a really popular website where people would just list jobs. So I just kind of went through there, looked for things that I thought were interesting. I knew I had something in mind. I knew I wanted to target a company that was a startup, a small company. So I found a listing for this company called Rapid7 in Boston. It was about 10 people. What they were doing was doing computer security. So they were helping other companies that were just coming on the internet secure their systems from hackers and things like that. So that sounded really cool. It was something similar that I had done in the military around computer security. So, I just clicked on the link, sent in my resume, and, they reached back out, and I got an interview. So, the other thing about small companies is when you go interview, you meet the CEO and the founder right away. It's not like...
How many people were working for the company?
It was about 10 people. So it was a very small company at the time. And so I went in, did an interview, met the head of sales, the CEO. I remember he quizzed me a lot of just my knowledge of how the internet worked. I remember his first question was just like, okay, imagine you open a web browser and you type in www.whatever.com. Explain to me what happens behind the scenes. How does it all work? And fortunately, I had done a lot of studying and I knew pretty well how the internet worked under the covers. So I think I impressed him in the interview because actually gave me an offer there on the spot.
Could you tell us in layman's terms for somebody like me, what does happen when you type in www?
Well, we could spend a lot of time on that, but I think what I explained was just how things like DNS. So for example, when you type in a domain name, when you have a domain name, say like apple.com, really what that is it translates to an IP address. So there's a system called DNS. You're going out and checking that system, looking up a number. So it turns those words into a number because computers operate in numbers. Humans operate in words. So apple.com is for humans, but computers don't know what that is. So you have to turn it into these numbers called an IP address. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that happens. As well.
It's probably way too technical for me, but did you, so you got the job that time?
Got the job.
And that's something that I think you need to be thinking about if you're in jail or prison. Now, those of you who have been working through the Prison Professors program know that we have built kind of an ecosystem built around what I learned of going through 26 years in prison. And one is that you have to be preparing yourself while you're in prison for the jobs that you're going to get when you come home. And then we create other products and services for the business community that will help more people avoid coming into the criminal justice system. And we generate revenues from that. But I'll tell you something that's interesting, and that is I interview a lot of people who come out, formerly incarcerated people, and we provide jobs for those people. Well, we interviewed a guy last week. He also has a really nice pedigree with university degrees and a successful career in business, but he has a felony conviction. And he told us a story of he submitted 186 different applications and didn't get one call back. That's what I want you to be thinking about. It's great if you've made brilliant decisions as a young man and you've built your career and got academic credentials and went into the military, and people want to have you not only because of your knowledge, but because he's shown character and he's shown discipline and he's discussed a work ethic. And that's what you've got to be thinking about right now. If you expect that you're going to get resistance, you can start building a plan and infrastructure, develop your communication skills, develop your writing skills, develop your math skills, and so when somebody asks you a question, you can answer as effortlessly as we just heard James Patterson tell us what a DNS or how Apple, and that's what I want you to be thinking about. So how long did you stay in this position?
So I was there about 3 years. And then I went off, and so I was in Boston at the time where I grew up, and this was kind of the internet revolution, and a lot of that was happening in California. So I knew I kind of wanted to move out to California. That's around that time Facebook was being formed, and Google had been around for a couple of years, but everything in the internet seemed to be happening in California. So similarly, I kind of went online and I looked for, what were some interesting new companies that were launching in California. And there was this company called Yammer.
And how big was Yammer at the time?
So when I joined, there were 6 employees. So
wow.
A little bit even smaller than.
And did they have funding from venture capitalists, or was it just a startup in a garage at that time?
So they had a small amount of funding when I joined, but they hadn't raised the kind of bigger round of funding later. It was sort of a spin out. Yammer was a spin out from a different company called Genie, which was a social network for families. And Yammer ended up being a social network for companies. So a lot of the early employees at Genie went over and went to Yammer. I was the first one that joined that had not come from the previous company.
And what was the product or the value proposition that Yammer offered to prospective customers?
So it allowed companies to create internal private social networks. So if you think of like Facebook and Twitter as public social networks, so it's a way you'd communicate with friends and family, Yammer was a similar concept, but it's a way you would communicate with your coworkers. And it was private, so it wasn't accessible to anyone outside the company. So people would use it to talk about things that they were working on. So for example, at Yammer, we used Yammer a lot internally to talk about, what we were working on, what we were building. When I joined the company, it was 6 employees. Eventually, there was around 500 employees. When the company got really big, Yammer was a useful tool to keep everyone connected. You could do things like share photos, share documents, just to see what other people in the company were working on.
How does Yammer differ from a company like Slack, which sounds like it does that same thing today?
They're simlar. So Yammer was a lot earlier than Slack. Slack came later. Slack is I would say maybe somewhat of a next evolution of Yammer. So eventually Yammer got acquired by Microsoft, which is a much bigger company. And then a couple of years after that, Slack Slack launch. But ultimately, Yammer and Slack kind of are a similar value proposition. Slack actually was also recently acquired by Salesforce. So that's often happens in technology is a lot of these companies, you create a startup and then it eventually gets bought and acquired by one of the larger tech companies and incorporated into their platform.
And when you started with Yammer, were you involved in like corporate structuring as well? Because I mean, you start with 6 and you grow to 500 people. I got to think you saw everything happening. Could you help us understand the evolution of a company from a 6-person group to, I guess, maybe 20 and then 20 to 100 and then 100 to, how does that grow?
Yeah. It was one of the, probably the most interesting and rewarding experiences being part of something that was really small to grow.
How long did that growth trajectory take?
So the company went from about 6 employees to 500 in about 3.5 years. So incredible growth just in terms of just new people coming in. So one of the things I say, and since I've been involved in a lot of these companies, the companies go through different evolutions. So probably it's like 0 to 10, right? You're a very small team, very tight. Everyone knows everything. And then eventually you start hiring more and more people. But
is there that discussion between those 10, we need to grow over the next 3 months, we need to bring on 20 more people? How does that conversation work? And then how does the culture grow around that?
Yeah, so at Yammer, it was more of a consensus. So, there was a discussion. Are we, should we grow? It wasn't obvious that at the time that we should grow because there's a question of like, well, are we growing too fast? Are we going to get people, are we going to be bringing in people who aren't a good fit? For our culture. So I think one is making sure that the company culture, you define your values. So for example, at Yammer, one of our biggest values was openness. That when we thought about the product we were building, it was really to help companies become more open internally. So we adopted for ourselves that we were going to be very open internally. And what that meant was, making sure you shared with your coworkers everything that you were working on, that you were okay with your work being criticized, right? A lot of people don't like their work being criticized, but we just felt that if you were, if as long as the criticism came from a good place and it was intellectually honest, ultimately we had a better outcome. So it was making sure that when we were bringing on new people, that they aligned to the company values. So that was a really important step, was really defining and articulating what are our values, what do we stand for, and then making sure that all the new people come in are aligned with those values.
And if somebody were going to be thinking about going into the career field in the future, and they may not be going out for years down the road, what are some of the values that a growing company is going to be looking for in a team member? And I'm not only talking about having really impeccable credentials and skills, just values. When you talk about values, what does that mean to you as somebody who's hired, I got to imagine, dozens, if not hundreds of people?
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways it depends on the company, but I do think there are some universal things that I've seen across multiple companies. So, I think that one is, and I go back to it, is being accountable. When I think about what makes someone successful versus not, I think generally it's someone who, the heuristic I like to do is someone who does what they say and say what they do, right? So that, if you say you're going to get something done, that you get it done. Because ultimately, if you disappoint your boss, and the other thing I've learned is everyone has a boss, right? I've been a CEO. CEOs have bosses, right? It's either your board or to some extent it's your customers. So you're making as a CEO even, you're making promises to your customers. You're going to do certain things, and the single fastest path to failure is not following up on your commitments, right? Saying that I'm going to accomplish X. And sometimes bad things happen, but it shouldn't be sort of from a lack of effort. Sometimes you can't control for everything, but ultimately, if you say you're going to do something, it's making sure that you follow up and get it done. And if it doesn't get done, making sure you have a very good reason and understanding as to why it didn't happen, and more importantly, why that. In the future, in a similar situation, you would make sure that the same thing didn't happen again.
And that's a lesson that would have been invaluable to me as I was walking through or climbing through this journey, knowing that someday I'm going to come back to society. And when I come back to society, I know I'm going to have to sit across the table from somebody like James Patterson. And James Patterson initially is going to be looking at me and saying, wow, you've been in prison for 26 years, and I can't do anything about that. That was a failed decision I made when I was 20 years old, and that was the result. But if I left it there, I'd have a very hard time getting through the door. But what I have found is if you can explain, this was my fault. I made this bad decision. This is what I did to make things right. Here's the record I've built, and this is why I can bring value to your company. That kind of conversation has opened enormous doors for me, and I know it can open doors for you, but it's not going to happen if you make excuses, and if it's not going to happen if you wait until you come home to start figuring out how you are going to answer those questions. James, could you give us one example in your long career of hiring people and building companies where you had to assess somebody that on paper, they may not have looked so good, but they were able to move the needle when they were talking with you and persuade you, I'm going to give a shot to this guy. Do you have any examples that you might, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I got to think there have been times when you've decided to give somebody a chance, even though they may not have fit the mold.
So I think, one example, is from my time at Yammer. So when I started at Yammer, I was an engineer, just working on the code. Eventually, I became the chief product officer. And what product management is you help you hire product managers who kind of work with the engineers. So one of the people I was looking for was to bring on a product manager. And I would say typically the background of a product manager was either someone who was an engineer before, or someone who has a business degree like an MBA. But one of the candidates I was interviewing, he didn't have any of that experience. He actually worked. He was a line cook at a restaurant in San Francisco. And
how did he approach you for the job?
Well, at the time we had Yammer had some recruiters, but I think ultimately he applied. And he did have he had done a summer with the program called Code for America. So it's a volunteer program where you actually go out and I think he went to Africa actually. Could be wrong, but he went somewhere for a year and you basically help teach people computers. So he had a little bit of a computer background, but at the time he was working at a restaurant as a line cook in San Francisco.
And he didn't have a university degree.
No.
Okay.
And so, but I knew that actually that chefs, especially it was a higher end restaurant, and I knew that chefs at higher end restaurants actually operated a lot like the military. There's a whole sort of theory to chefs, it's like, yes, chef, because, operating in a high-end commercial kitchen, to be able to think about when you're executing perfect dishes to hundreds of diners a night, everything has to be perfect. In order to execute that, you have to have a lot of discipline. You have to be able to follow instructions. So I knew that there was, to be able to be successful in that, you had to have a lot of really good traits that I thought were good in a product manager as well, to be able to work with engineers. He really impressed me in the interview. And, I do remember there was a little bit of resistance to bringing in someone who, had a bit of a non-traditional background. But ultimately, he ended up being really successful. And, I think he's gone on to lead product teams now. And that's just a good example of someone who, didn't fit the mold at all in Silicon Valley, but came from a different perspective, but ultimately was successful.
And that's something that I always like to ask people that create jobs and build businesses, because every one of them has a story of somebody that they decided, this person can bring value to my team. You read, if you're in there right now, you've read about diversity, you've read about the importance of different backgrounds and how that can help a team grow, and you could be a part of that. But it will only happen if you build your own story, you build your own infrastructure, you figure out a way to get yourself in the door, impress somebody during an interview, and demonstrate, I'm here to bring more value to the team. no, you don't owe me anything, but if you bring me on, I can do more. And I just want to thank you, James, for agreeing to come down here and help us share this message with people in prison. And in the next episode, I'd really like to talk with you about the importance of social justice and why you agreed to come down here and help us communicate with people who are locked in jails and prisons, and what guidance or advice you might be able to provide for those people so that they can use their time wisely inside and come back and become successful and talk their way into a successful interview. Fair enough?
Yep.
Good.